I spent most of my adult life separating real military signals from background noise, and I can tell you that Washington is not very good at that discipline anymore. Every movement, every exercise, every intelligence leak is immediately inflated into a narrative of imminent action. Claims that a campaign to eliminate Iran's supreme leader is about to begin fall squarely into that pattern. When I look at the available evidence, I don't see preparation for decapitation. I see signaling, some deliberate, some careless, layered on top of a strategic environment that many in Washington no longer understand. U.S. forces have maintained a long-standing presence around Iran's periphery for decades, from the Gulf states to Iraq to naval patrols in the Arabian Sea. That posture did not appear overnight, and it does not automatically imply an intention to strike at Iran's leadership. What has changed is the political use of that posture as theater, aimed at domestic audiences, allies who demand reassurance, and adversaries who are meant to feel pressure without triggering open war. The cause of this confusion is institutional decay. Strategy has been replaced by messaging. Military deployments are treated as rhetorical devices rather than instruments tied to clear political objectives. In this environment, speculation fills the vacuum left by the absence of coherent policy. The strategic consequence is dangerous miscalculation. Tehran watches U.S. behavior closely, not American headlines. Iranian planners understand force balances, escalation thresholds, and historical precedent. They know that targeted killing of a head of state is not a limited action, it is an act that collapses ambiguity and invites retaliation at scale. I've studied enough wars to know that when great powers drift into confrontation through signaling rather than strategy, they stumble into conflicts they neither intend nor can control. The lesson is straightforward. Before asking whether a campaign is about to begin, we should ask whether the United States has a defined political end state, a legal framework, and a tolerance for the consequences of escalation. Right now, I see none of those clearly in place. That absence tells me far more than any dramatic headline ever could. When people talk loosely about eliminating a foreign head of state, they usually skip the hard part, the legal and political thresholds that turn bravado into a strategic trap. I've watched administrations of both parties stretch authorities until they snap, and the first constraint Washington runs into is its own paper. Executive Order 12333 contains a clear prohibition on assassination by anyone acting on behalf of the U.S. government. And while lawyers can argue definitions and exceptions, that language is there for a reason. It reflects a long recognition that deliberately targeting national leaders is not simply another option on a menu of force. It is an act that changes the character of a conflict and invites the kind of retaliation and escalation that governments later pretend they never anticipated. The second threshold is constitutional and political. Congress is supposed to authorize war, and the War Powers Resolution requires consultation in every possible instance and notification within 48 hours when U.S. forces are introduced into hostilities or imminent hostilities. In practice, presidents often treat this as paperwork after the fact, but that habit does not erase the political reality. A strike on Iran's leadership would not be a discreet raid that stays hidden in the shadows. It would create immediate blowback, immediate risk to Americans in the region, and immediate pressure on the administration to either escalate or retreat. Either path is politically corrosive. Then there is international law, which is not a debating society topic when you are dealing with state-on-state force. The UN Charter's baseline rule is that states refrain from the threat or use of force against another state's territorial integrity or political independence, with self-defense as the classic exception. Washington can claim self-defense, as it did after the 2020 strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, but that claim lives or dies on evidence of an actual armed attack or an imminent one, and the burden of persuasion matters when you are trying to hold coalitions together, and keep a region from igniting. The lesson is simple. Once you cross these thresholds, you don't get to control the consequences with press releases. You inherit a war logic. When I hear claims that U.S. Special Forces are surrounding Iran from all directions, I go back to the map and the order of battle, because geography does not lie. The United States has maintained a dispersed military posture around Iran for years, not weeks or months. Bases in the Gulf states, rotational forces in Iraq and Syria, naval presence in the Fifth Fleet area of responsibility, and access agreements across the region are not new developments. They are the residue of earlier wars and unresolved commitments, not evidence of a sudden shift toward a decapitation campaign. What matters strategically is not proximity alone, but readiness, scale, and political intent. On those measures, the picture is far less dramatic than the headlines suggest. The cause of the current alarmism is a misunderstanding of how modern U.S. forces are actually employed. Special operations units operate globally, often quietly, but they do not function in a vacuum. Any serious operation against Iran's senior leadership would require extensive intelligence preparation, air and missile support, secure staging, and, most critically, a regional political environment willing to absorb the fallout. That environment does not exist. American forces in Iraq and Syria are exposed, lightly protected, and there, at the sufferance of fragile host governments, U.S. bases in the Gulf sit within range of Iranian missiles and drones that have been demonstrated repeatedly against regional targets. Naval forces operate under constant surveillance in confined waters where escalation can happen quickly and accidentally. The strategic consequence of this posture is vulnerability, not dominance. Forward presence without a coherent strategy becomes a liability. Iranian planners understand this. They do not need to match the United States platform for platform. They only need to threaten enough pain in enough places to raise the cost of action beyond what Washington is prepared to pay. I've seen this dynamic before, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, where superior firepower failed to translate into political control. The lesson is that surrounding a country militarily is not the same as controlling escalation. Without regional consensus, clear objectives, and public support at home, posture becomes bluff. And bluff in a region like this is a dangerous substitute for strategy. When analysts in Washington talk casually about removing Iran's supreme leader, they reveal how little they understand Iran's internal security architecture and deterrence logic. I've studied adversaries who expect to be targeted, and Iran is one of them. This is a state that has lived under sanctions, covert action, and military threat since 1979. Its leadership has survived war with Iraq, internal unrest, and decades of intelligence pressure precisely because it built a system designed for continuity under attack. Power in Iran is not concentrated in a single man in the way Western observers often imagine. Authority is distributed across institutions, councils, and security organizations that are redundant by design. Remove one node, and the system adapts. The cause of Western miscalculation here is mirror imaging. American planners assume that decapitation produces paralysis because that is often how centralized client states behave. Iran is different. Its internal security layers include the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, multiple intelligence services, hardened command facilities, and a culture of operational secrecy shaped by long experience. Personal security for senior leaders is not static or predictable, and any attempt to penetrate it would require sustained access, cooperation from insiders, and time. Those requirements increase exposure and dramatically raise the chance of failure or compromise. The strategic consequence of ignoring this reality is escalation without payoff. Even if a strike succeeded tactically, it would not collapse the Iranian state or end its regional influence. What it would do is trigger a retaliation doctrine that Iran has openly developed for years. Iran's deterrence does not rest on matching U.S. conventional power. It rests on layered missile forces, drones, cyber capabilities, and aligned actors across the region who can apply pressure against U.S. forces, partners, and global commerce. These tools are designed to be survivable, deniable at first, and politically costly for the United States to confront. The lesson is one history teaches repeatedly. States that expect decapitation learn how to absorb it. Strategic deterrence is about convincing your opponent that the price of action outweighs the benefit. Iran has spent decades doing exactly that. Any serious strategist must assume that Iran's response would be measured, multi-domain, and sustained long after the initial shock faded from American news cycles. One of the most persistent illusions in Washington is the belief that escalation can be calibrated with precision, that force can be applied surgically and then neatly contained. I've watched this theory fail repeatedly. War does not unfold on whiteboards. It unfolds through human reactions, institutional momentum, and political fear. When a state crosses a major threshold, especially one involving leadership targeting it, steps onto an escalation ladder that neither side fully controls. Each rung narrows the space for restraint and accelerates the logic of retaliation. This is not conjecture. It is the observable pattern of modern conflict. The cause of unintended war is rarely malice. It is a misjudgment. Decision-makers convince themselves that the other side will absorb a blow, calculate rationally, and choose restraint. But Iran's strategic culture does not reward passivity in the face of existential threats. Its leadership has repeatedly signaled that attacks on core regime symbols demand responses that restore deterrence. That response does not have to be symmetrical. It only has to be painful and persistent enough to demonstrate resolve. Once that cycle begins, the United States faces a dilemma it has encountered before: escalate further and widen the war, or absorb losses and appear weakened. The strategic consequence is regional ignition. U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, the Gulf, and at sea become immediate targets. Allies who host American bases are drawn into the conflict whether they consent or not. Energy infrastructure, shipping lanes, and global markets react instantly. None of this requires Iran to defeat the United States militarily. It only requires Iran to make continued engagement politically unsustainable. I've seen this dynamic play out in slow motion in Iraq after 2003 and in Afghanistan over 2 decades, where tactical success masked strategic failure. The lesson is one that professional militaries are supposed to internalize. Escalation is not a ladder you climb alone. Your opponent climbs with you, often in ways you did not predict. Once blood is spilled at the highest political level, diplomacy collapses, back channels close, and the space for de-escalation shrinks to almost nothing. What begins as a supposed limited action can end as a war no one planned, and no one can easily end. Before shots are fired, narratives are launched, and in many cases, they are the primary weapon. I've watched information warfare evolve from a supporting function into a substitute for strategy. Leaks to friendly journalists, anonymous briefings, exaggerated assessments of capability, and deliberate ambiguity are used to create psychological pressure on adversaries and reassurance for allies. In the current environment, claims about encirclement, special forces activity, or imminent action often say more about Washington's internal anxieties than about any operational plan. This is signaling aimed at shaping perceptions, not announcing decisions. The danger is that information warfare, once unleashed, takes on a life of its own. The cause of this reliance on narrative is political paralysis. When leaders lack consensus at home and clarity abroad, they turn to messaging as a way to appear decisive without committing to irreversible action. Iran is not the intended audience for much of this. Tehran filters Western rhetoric through decades of experience and intelligence collection. The real targets are domestic constituencies, regional partners who fear abandonment, and rivals who are meant to be deterred by spectacle. But psychological pressure cuts both ways. When you inflate threats publicly, you narrow your own room to maneuver. You create expectations that must either be fulfilled or explained away. The strategic consequence is erosion of credibility. Adversaries learn to discount rhetoric while preparing for worst-case scenarios. Allies grow nervous when words outpace deeds. Inside the U.S. system, military planners are forced to hedge against political statements that may never translate into orders. This mismatch between talk and action increases the risk of misinterpretation, accidents, and overreaction. History is full of wars that began not with deliberate intent, but with misread signals amplified by public posturing. The lesson is one every serious strategist should understand. Information warfare is not cost-free. Psychological pressure that is not backed by coherent policy and credible restraint becomes noise, and noise in a tense security environment is dangerous. If the United States intends deterrence, it must communicate limits as clearly as threats. Otherwise, narrative dominance becomes a brittle illusion, one that collapses the moment events refuse to follow the script. When I step back and look at the full picture, the strategic consequences of pursuing leadership elimination as a tool of policy are unmistakable. Such an action would not restore American primacy, strengthen deterrence, or stabilize the Middle East. It would accelerate the erosion of U.S. influence and harden the very forces Washington claims it wants to restrain. Power in the international system is shifting toward a multipolar reality, where regional actors possess the means to impose costs without matching American strength symmetrically. Iran is emblematic of that shift. It does not need to defeat the United States. It only needs to outlast American political patience. The cause of repeated failure is a refusal to accept limits. For 3 decades, U.S. strategy has been driven by the assumption that credibility requires constant demonstrations of force. In practice, credibility comes from consistency, restraint, and an accurate assessment of interests. Striking at Iran's leadership would define Iran as an existential enemy permanently, eliminate any remaining diplomatic off-ramps, and push regional states to hedge against American unpredictability. It would also reinforce a global perception that Washington relies on coercion because it lacks a viable political strategy. The strategic consequence of continuing down this path is isolation and overextension. Resources are finite, public support is fragile. Military force, when detached from achievable political objectives, becomes a blunt instrument that damages the wielder as much as the target. I've seen this movie before. In Iraq and Afghanistan, tactical brilliance and operational dominance could not compensate for strategic incoherence. The result was exhaustion, loss of credibility, and a diminished capacity to influence events elsewhere. The alternative is not appeasement, it is strategic realism. That means defining vital interests narrowly, accepting that not every adversary can be reshaped, and using diplomacy backed by credible but restrained military power. It means recognizing that deterrence works best when both sides understand the rules and the limits. Empires do not usually collapse because they are defeated outright. They collapse because they refuse to adjust to reality. The United States still has choices. What it lacks, at the moment, is the discipline to make them.